technically I have done one custom loop before, but in a lot of ways, this is almost like doing my first custom loop. So yeah, why don't we all work on this together and kind of see how it's done. Hopefully, if you guys are thinking of doing your own custom water cooling loop, get some tips and tricks that at least I ran across that might help you out. Hey guys, Hardware Hound here, and yes, we are working on reviewing the Swiftech Boreas custom cooling kit. This is a it's not assembled because you got to do the assembly yourself, but all the pieces are put together. You order the kit and then they send everything to you that you need in one box, which is really helpful because it kind of saves trouble in having to do things like decide what fittings you need, deciding what kind of coolant you want to use. They also include a lot of the accessories, dyes, installation stuff, so it does speed up the process. Now we're going to review this kit as well, and as you can see, I'm actually running a stress test back here. And so I don't know if you guys know much about the Ryzen 2000 series processors, but jamming 1.5 volts is not something most people recommend. And I don't recommend it either. But yes, I am testing 1.5 volts through this thing, and this kit is doing a great job already. So this thing's running full bore too, and I can barely hear it, and I doubt you're going to hear anything on the camera. So we're going to be reviewing this kit and actually putting numbers and temperatures to it, and I'm already impressed with it. But for now, let's talk about putting this custom cooling kit together. So number one step that you really need to do is you got to plan your loop out. You need to know where things are going to go and what direction you want it to go. So in the case of me here, I knew I wanted to go out of the port here. I knew I was going to go straight to my processor and then go up to the rad. And I knew I was going to have the fittings on this end of my case. Now that seems pretty self-explanatory, but if you're going to do anything different on that, you want to plan that out ahead of time. Now, after I got done with that, I hadn't even started putting anything together. First thing I did is I took all the fittings and put them into all the different pieces. So each fitting has a small rubber gasket right there at the end. And so when you're tightening that thing down, you've got to make sure that that gasket is sitting all the way into the hole. So you want to make sure you tighten it pretty tightly. You're going to need some form of crescent wrench. So what you'll do is you'll unscrew the fitting part that kind of clamps down the hose. You're going to unscrew that part and you're going to see the, hexagonal looking shape there that you can put your crescent wrench on. Go ahead and tighten that thing down pretty decently, particularly when you're tightening into the rad or into the acrylic block. Those things are pretty sturdy. Now, don't He-Man it though. Don't be sitting there just cranking as hard as you can. What I like to do is I would stick my wrench on there and then I kind of put a good solid pressure on it. And then what I would do is I just kind of tap the pressure with my hand like that. So it's kind of like an impact drill, except, we're not going to impact it really hard. And what that would do is it would just kind of nicely snug up that fitting right into the acrylic or the copper, without feeling like I was going to split anything or crack or strip it out. Now, that being said, with the block, the bottom part of the reservoir and the radiator, no problems. But when I first was planning this loop, I was thinking I was going to do my inlet into the reservoir up top instead of on the bottom, which is what I decided to do later. When I was screwing the fitting into the top, I started trying to kind of ease it tight, and it started stripping out the threads. Now, I didn't actually strip out the threads entirely, but the plastic cap on top of the reservoir is a lot softer than anything else. So do not crank that hard. I kind of wish Swiftech would have used a harder plastic for it, but I have a feeling that if I needed to replace it, thankfully I didn't completely strip it out, so I was able to put the plugs back in, no problem. But I bet you if I needed a new cap, Swiftech could send me one in a heartbeat and it wouldn't be a big deal. But keep in mind, guys, on the top of these reservoirs, these particular ones from Swiftech, that plastic's a lot softer, so be careful with it. So once I got all my fittings in, I started going ahead and putting the pieces into my build. Yes, I have not done anything with hoses yet. All I've got is fittings, and so I put everything in. Now, with the reservoir, I did something kind of unique where I was able to mount the reservoir to one of my SSD trays on the H500P. And that worked out great because this kit's actually going to have to come out and go back in a little bit while I'm doing a bunch of CPU cooler testing. So I didn't want to permanently attach it. So I've got this really cool setup there now where I don't have it that way. Of course, I went ahead and put the fans on the radiator while it was outside of the build. So that way all I had to do was put the whole radiator up there and screw it in. Swiftech only included 4 screws with the radiator, which I thought was really cool because they basically were saying, hey, you don't need more than 4 screws to hold a radiator up in the case. And they're exactly right. The copper radiator is plenty rigid enough that it's not going to have any problems as long as you got 4 screws in the ends. So I get the radiator in, I go ahead and put the block on there. Now for the AM4 socket, there's actually 2 brackets that you have to screw onto the mounts on the block first. And then once those are screwed on, that actually allows it to be compatible with the AM4 socket for AMD Ryzen motherboards. So I get those things, so I got all those things installed, I've got everything in place. Now that I've got it installed, I went to the hoses. All I did is really simple. I didn't measure, didn't do anything fancy. I just grabbed an end, stuck it on the reservoir, and I started on my outlet from the reservoir and went up to the processor. I kind of just eyeballed it. And then what I did is I didn't want to pinch the hose. You could probably just cut this hose with scissors. If you have hardline tubing, you're going to need like a kind of pipe cutter, kind of like what this thing is. This thing's for actually copper pipe, but it works on hardline as well. But with, the soft rubber kind of hosing, you can just cut it probably with scissors. But I didn't want to crimp it too hard, so I used a razor blade and just pushed it down so I'd get kind of a nice even cut. I'd cut it, then I'd put the end back up and see if I felt like it was still a little too long. And I'd always try to err on a slight long side. And then once I put it up there, if I felt like it was a little too loose, I'd cut off a little bit more on the end and then be good to go. When you're squeezing your hoses onto the fittings, don't forget to put the screw-on parts of the fittings onto the hose first. Otherwise, you're going to have to pull that hose back off. And once you push it on there, it's actually pretty tight. It's not super hard to pull off, but you have to pretty well wiggle and pull on it pretty hard. So I pushed on the hose there, then I went up to the reservoir, and I found out that to my radiator, and my reservoir was actually in the way. So I was kind of glad that I didn't have it super secured down. And so one thing I would say is, when you're placing your reservoir, just kind of get a rough idea of where you want it, but don't lock it down hardcore yet. Because if you're having trouble reaching or fitting a hose, you may need to slide that reservoir out and then be able to reach up, which is exactly what I had to do. So I slid the reservoir out, was able to reach the hose from going to the block up to the radiator. Then, once I got that done, going from the other end of the radiator back down to the reservoir to complete the loop was no problem. All right, I've got all the hoses done. I screwed on all my fittings. Screw those things on as tight as you can. You can finger tighten them as tight as you can. You shouldn't need more than that, but don't skimp on it. Make sure those things are nice and tight. You don't want leaks. Now I'm going to fill the loop. So Swiftech included a squeeze bottle that's excellent for doing that. And so what's nice is that you once you put the spout, you got a connecting hose that goes all the way to the bottom of the bottle, so you don't have to tip it to squeeze it. It squeezes from the bottom, which is great because it makes it very easy not to accidentally drip on your components and stuff. So I filled the reservoir almost all the way to full, almost what you can see right now here on this video. So then we don't want to turn this thing on and risk shorting the system. So I switched the switch off to my power supply, grabbed a secondary power supply, threw a loopback plug in it, and used that to power the pump. Now I haven't connected any of the other connections yet. I am just going to fill this loop. So I flipped on that power supply, and I had another filled. I pretty much used everything in that one fill of the fill bottle. So I refilled the fill bottle, and then when I flipped that switch on, I was ready to put more in. Because if you drain out this reservoir and there's air, you do not want to run this pump without liquid in there. It can damage the pump. So as soon as I started seeing that reservoir start getting low, I started pumping more in. And if I wasn't able to keep up, I'd flip that switch on the power supply. Now, with this loop, it had more than enough in the first fill up to keep it from running empty. But then, of course, I wanted to top off the reservoir again anyway. But if you had like a couple of graphics cards and maybe 2 radiators, you would quickly exhaust even this larger reservoir, and you need to make sure you keep enough fluid topped off until you get the full loop filled up. So yeah, got the loop filled, had it running, left the power supply running. You know what? Let's let that pressure go for a while. If we happen to spring a leak in the next few minutes, it'd be nice to do that without the system. Now, I was a little risky, and I'm also kind of trying to hurry up through other review works, so I only let it run for about half an hour before I started turning the system on. But if you really want to be safe, you could let that run for like 24 hours, see if you ever happen to spring a leak before you turn your system on. Now, once I was done with filling the loop, then I had to get all the connections connected. So Swiftech has what they call their Iris controller that has fan control and RGB LED, addressable RGB control. So they only have 3 ports for the addressable RGB. Now, as you know, I've got 3 fans plus a block and the reservoir. That's actually 5 things, but the fans had a daisy chain connector. So I daisy chained the 3 fans together, so I only had to plug 1 connector into the controller from the fans. Then I had the other 2 spots for the block and the reservoir. I wish Swiftech had put a little longer cable on the reservoir. It was actually a tight reach. I was able to do it, and they had just enough, which was good. But it was a tight reach to get to both the block and the reservoir onto the connector for controlling the lighting there. Now, Swiftech also has a motherboard, addressable motherboard adapter that will just take the signal from your motherboard and shoot it out to all 3 things. We'll look more into that when we do just flat out lighting review at a later point. So once I had all that connected, I plugged in my 3 fans. Make sure you plug one of your fans into that channel 1, which will usually have a red cover on it, so that way your motherboard can sense the RPM speed of the 3 fans that are connected. Had everything connected, don't forget you'll need SATA power for the Iris controller, and you'll need a Molex connection for the pump on the reservoir. I wish that Molex was SATA, but that pump's probably pulling too many amps for SATA, so I have a feeling Molex is kind of necessary in this particular case. So once that's all said and done, I turned this baby on, and we were good to go. So now I am finishing my stress testing. I'm going to see just how far I can push this loop, and we're going to be comparing it to a lot of coolers. So yeah, pretty fun times coming in. Guys, let me know if you have any questions on putting together this loop. I believe I covered everything, and kind of hoping that I'll give you guys some help on that. You know, feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll get to what I can. And hey, if some of you guys have experience, help out. Throw some answers in there. And, you know, just remember that everybody starts somewhere. So try not to be too harsh to each other down there. Let me know what you think of this video. I hope it helps you guys out. Stay tuned to my channel and my website. We're going to be bringing in the reviews. I'll catch you later.